Hello, and thank you for joining us on the Exploring Consciousness podcast.
And welcome to another episode with your co-host, Donna and me, Natasha Williams.
This podcast is a field guide for people who would like some help and guidance on their spiritual path. I introduce, review, and share consciousness in its many dimensions. This is for the curious adventurer who isn't afraid of asking for help. So dream, dare, and let's begin today's episode. Hello, and welcome Exploring Consciousness podcast listeners. Today I'm going to introduce to you a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, Raymond O'Brien. I first met Raymond on the Seeking Heaven, the Near-Death Experience YouTube channel hosted by my friend Tamara Calder Richardson. Raymond and I hit it off very well and followed each other on Facebook ever since. I knew having him on the Exploring Consciousness podcast was going to be powerful, and it has been. Natasha and I decided to have 4 talking points for Raymond because we knew he had much to say, and hopefully doing it this way, we'd find out things about him we didn't know. That proved to be a good strategy. The 4 talking points were: 1, before. Who Raymond was before his NDE, and a little bit about his family and what it was like growing up in Germany. Number 2, during. Having Raymond describe his cardiac arrest that led to his first 10 NDEs on the same night. We also asked him specific questions about who he saw and what he felt on the other side during his NDEs. Number 3, after. We asked Raymond about the trauma that followed his NDEs, his 5 years of isolation, his volunteer work in the chemo unit in the hospital that saved his life. And 4, now. Raymond shared his life now and how he's trying to get the word out about how to address the many PTSD symptoms associated with NDE survivors, which is critical in healing emotional, social, and psychological impacts of surviving an NDE. We broke the interview into 2 parts. Wednesday, we'll be discussing the talking points 1 and 2. Then on Friday, talking points 3 and 4. Now, this all sounds good and structured, but we let the interview flow in a way that Raymond could tell his story without being re-traumatized by the sheer act of speaking it again. When he told us of the trauma that his German Jewish mother's family faced during and after World War II, we understood why the family secrets were not to be shared. His account is quite emotional and moving. He didn't learn of most of his own family events and who they were until he was in his 20s. They moved from Germany to Ireland and eventually came to live permanently in England. He didn't even know about his father's poor cardiac health until after his own occurred. What he did know that he came from a family of seers and healers, and he knew that those gifts passed down to him. He wanted nothing to do with them. He told us of his early gifts of seeing, but as he grew, he decided to lead a drug-filled and alcohol-fueled lifestyle to keep the voices in his head quiet. He had held different types of jobs, but ended up being a gas engineer for most of his life before his cardiac arrest. Americans know this work is heating and plumbing. All this led up to his cardiac arrest and his verified 10 near-death experiences one night in the spring of 2009. His story is full of family, discovery, trauma, death, and his remarkable life journey now as a registered healer, counselor, and seer. Now, here's his biography, some of which we will discuss, and some of it I will just tell you about now and not during the interview. Raymond O'Brien was born to a Jewish mother and an Irish father. His mother's side of the family was a family of seers. He grew up trying very hard not to acknowledge his unique family gifts. He was heavy into drugs and an alcohol-fueled lifestyle. As an adult, in 2009, his mother foretold of the dire consequences if he didn't change this lifestyle. Soon after, a voice warned him that he was going to die. That night, he collapsed in his house and he couldn't finish his phone call for help. The cat whose life he had saved licked his face and breathed him back into consciousness, and he was able to finish his phone call. Thank you, Mr. B. This was a night of terror and revelation as he was rushed to the hospital, unable to breathe, going into cardiac arrest. Deciding to let himself go, Raymond passed over to the other side where he became one with everything and encountered spiritual beings. He died 10 times that night and has had other multiple near-death experiences. He's been so traumatized by these near-death experiences that he stopped keeping count. He described how these NDEs impacted him and what happened in the hospital, how the staff responded and still do to this day. He also shares that what he has seen as a medical intuitive has been validated by medical staff and the clergy while he worked on a hospital chemotherapy unit as a healer. His work with clients ranges from experiences of terrorism to surviving near-death experiences. Raymond will discuss how NDEs impact a survivor's daily life, their social interactions, their relationships with friends, family, and the medical personnel who treat them. Raymond came to grips that he is a natural-born medical intuitive, and then worked with the medical profession to help NDE survivors try to process the psychological ripples that come through such an event. Not only for survivors, but campaigns heavily for medical professionals to recognize the signs of an NDE and the trauma associated with such events to provide appropriate aftercare. He has spent 18 months on a chemo unit as a registered healer and as a diagnostic seer with the Healing Trust UK, and has done voluntary work for a major UK charity as a trained counselor. Raymond has spoken at the prestigious Royal London Teaching Hospital about the psychological effects of surviving a cardiac arrest, be this trauma or STEs, spiritually transformative experiences that they have after their NDE. On a quick side note, the acronym STE was coined by Dr. Yvonne Kaysen in 1994 in her groundbreaking book, A Farther Shore. Her Spiritual Awakenings International website says, and I quote, "Spiritually transformative experiences is an umbrella term for a broad range of spiritual and paranormal experiences of consciousness that all tend to cause a spiritual awakening and gradual expansion of one's range of consciousness. All types of STEs tend to transform experiencers' values in a more spiritual direction and propel an increased desire to be loving, ethical, and of service to others." Raymond has also been published by Johns Hopkins University in connection with the gap of care for survivors about near death and the lack of care and understanding of this in the medical world, as well as how he incorporates his own NDEs in his own practice of helping survivors of NDE/STEers. Raymond is a member of the British Association of Counselors and Psychotherapists. He's been invited to speak about his NDE multiple resuscitations with anomalistic psychology professor Chris French, cardiac arrest lecturer, and Professor Ken Spearpoint, to the key NHS medical professions on litigious resuscitation issues at Tarrant Valley Hospital. Raymond is currently putting together a working model of addressing the many PTSD symptoms associated with near-death survivors, which is integral to his approach to emotional and psychological healing. He tells of the importance of normalizing the NDE and how to help experiencers learn to choose the correct therapist who can help them process and integrate their NDE via validation, education, and support. On several other podcasts, Raymond has shared how the traumatizing gap of care exacerbated the after effects of his NDE, leading to 5 years of isolation, and how this and other traumas played a major role in his wanting to provide NDE trauma counseling services for NDE survivors. He currently lives outside of London, England, with his significant other, Fox, ravens, and cats. Please listen to my dear friend and fellow NDEer, Raymond O'Brien. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. We publish our Exploring Consciousness podcast on the Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of the second week of every month. Please check the podcast schedule and more on our companion website, exploreconsciousness.com. Thank you again for listening.